we need to be able to receive a lot of data, a lot of information coming in and make decisions quickly. That's how we become good leaders. It's impossible to get all the information. The best intervention is usually our mindsets, not our skill sets. Leaders, you've got a lot of skill. It's like, what do we need to upgrade in the operating system and the mindsets? When I shifted my own operating system to a belief that what if you are completely whole, complete, and excellent, but through life there have been blockages or forgetting, and that my job is not to change you, but to help recover that. That shift in stance, that shift in perspective changed how I am with you as a client. When I started, there's a deficiency, something's wrong with you. And I really operated from that for years.
Welcome back to a new episode of Business Unbound. Every week, I sit down with exceptional practitioners who share how they actually think about the most consequential matters in their domain. We explore the mental models, the frameworks, and the instincts they have developed over the course of their careers. You get what took them decades to build in one conversation, and you leave with a sharper thinking for the decisions that you face. I'm your host, Florian Hoff. Today, I'm joined by Dave Schoof. Dave is an executive leadership consultant and an executive coach at the world-renowned Swiss business school IMD. But what makes his perspective distinctive is really his background. He brings nearly 2 decades in US counterintelligence and national security, followed by more than 20 years coaching senior leaders, founders, and executives teams through transition, trust, and uncertainty. In this conversation, we explore what his intelligence background taught him about reading uncertainty as a field of signals rather than a problem to be eliminated, and how that changes the way a leader should decide under real pressure. This is Business Unbound. Let's dive in. Dave Schoof, welcome to Business Unbound.
Thank you, Florian. It's good to be here.
To set the scene for people meeting you for the first time, Dave, what are you spending most of your time on at the moment, and what kinds of situations are leaders typically in when they come to you?
Yes, great question. I think these days, I've really focused my offer, my practice, how I work with people in the context of the great change that we're going through. You'll hear the words meta crisis or polycrisis, a level of complexity that we haven't navigated before. And leaders have always had to deal with change. But I think there's a level of complication now because of the amount of change, the impact of global change, right down to relationship changes and systems changes. So how to navigate this. And I became very interested in systems theory. I work with leaders not to move away from what they've learned, their best practices, their experiences, but how to make room for, a creative response when we're in new territory, when doing things the way they used to be just no longer work. And on a personal level, I work with a lot of leaders that have been very, very successful. And all of a sudden, those formulas for success just aren't getting traction. And that's a sweet point. That's an intersection point for me to come in.
Mm-hmm. And I'm curious, when you talk about meta crisis, what is it that you're actually referring to?
Yeah. So, from the pandemic onwards, there has been an acceleration of complexity that leaders in organizations are working with. I have clients that supply chains were disrupted, clients that, with the onset of AI, the change in the work environment, um, all have impacted on how organizations can thrive. So the geopolitical landscape is changing very quickly. So there's almost like layers of change happening. Back when I was a leader, it was, a couple of things were happening, in the world, or, there was an organizational shift to change the culture, but it was almost like a linear concept of change. Today, I'd almost draw it as intersecting spirals, that are all feeding each other. So how do you make sense? What do you trust as a leader for guidance? How do you make sense of not only the data, but also what's happening with your people. How do you inspire followership? These are old questions, but in new context.
And we will explore these questions and potentially others in just a moment. Before we do this, I noticed when I looked at your background that you have a combination that I find is very rare: 2 decades
Mm,
in counterintelligence and national security work, and then also more than 2 decades of coaching senior leaders through transitions and uncertainty. And I'm wondering if you had to distill these two perspectives, what
mm.
has this combination kind of trained you to notice that even very capable leaders or very capable advisors often miss?
Yep. I think how that has served me is, first of all, a deeper understanding of there's never a clear picture. You know, you'll hear people with a military background use the expression the fog of war. In fast changing situations, it's rare that we can get all of the facts. So we're left to speculate, but we can't wait until we know all of the facts. We can't do analysis to mitigate all risks. So you have to be able to move. And I think the background I had, you had to almost calibrate, recalibrate, shift. The agile philosophies that came in over the recent decades are kind of built on that. It's not enough, there's more, but I think that's what served me well, is being able to pay attention to what might be invisible to other people. The what's going on in the room, the dynamics that aren't being spoken. What are the undiscussables? The space between people, what's happening? What's that energetic quality? I had to become very sensitive to that for the nature of my work, and also really understanding human nature. At the end of the day, leaders need followers. And that's actually quite an emotional response in a human being, to invest in a goal, in a strategy, and in a leader. So how can a leader foster that kind of followership? That intrigued me.
And let's maybe stick with this theme of followership, as I
Sure.
believe is something which becomes ever more important, especially in the age of AI, certainly.
Mm,
How do leaders build followership?
yeah. I think of my own experience, it wasn't logic. It was a combination of trust and being inspired, like stepping into their vision and seeing my own role in it. So not just supporting them, but seeing something in that for me. So, if I flip that, the art of enrollment, which is something in my background, was something I needed to learn. Um, so a leader understanding what motivates their people and how to really light that fire, that's a key piece. So that gets into relationships, that gets into um, almost a counterintuitive move for a lot of leaders. When I was a leader, I remember thinking I needed to have all the answers. I needed to show confidence. I needed to be bold to get followership. And those elements are true, but I always didn't have all the facts. I didn't always know. I was in uncertainty. If I put up a facade, people are going to smell that. It's like garlic on your breath after lunch. So how do you stay authentic and inspire? I think that's the thing. And that's a very vulnerable place for leaders, because we're kind of hardwired to get it right, know what's going on, and have absolute projections of confidence.
And perhaps we can make this slightly more concrete for the audience members tuning into this episode. When we say, okay, in order to build followership, you need at least two elements. One is inspiration; you need to inspire people, and the other one is building trust. Concretely speaking, how
Hmm.
do you do these two elements? What is
Hmm.
what is it that a leader, practically speaking, can do? What behaviors should they exhibit? How should they think about it?
I remember working with a bunch of scientists, and they said, Dave, give us a formula for trust. And I had to think really fast on my feet. And I wrote T equals S1 plus S2 plus I'm sorry, C1 plus C2 plus C3 over R. It may not be mathematically accurate, But what the components were is the first thing we look for trust is competency. Can you do what you're saying you're going to do? The second is consistency. Are you going to walk your talk? Are you going to show up? Are you going to be there? The third one is an interesting one, and that is, do you show care? Do you care? In the business context, do you care what I care about in achieving these goals? And that last C, that care, is actually one of the greatest levers for obtaining trust. But all three are necessary and they mitigate risk. That's the R underneath. So people are consciously and unconsciously looking for those. And leaders are looking for that in their people as well, in their teams. So demonstrating that is really important. Now, competence is not to be confused with putting up a front of always having the answers. Being able to say, I don't know, or being able to say, you know, what's coming down from up top, I don't necessarily agree yet either, but we're in this together and I'm going to share what's going on for me. So there's an element of vulnerability that I'm finding over and over again that is one of the most powerful attributes of leadership as well.
I like this model that you've drawn, the three
Mm,
C plus the over R, mitigating risk. Based on the coaching work that you have done, do you recall, if you can share, like a concrete example where you think there was a leader who has done an extraordinary job building this trust and kind of like personifying this framework that you explained?
absolutely. And often I'm brought in or I'm asked to work with someone when it's not evident. So, you know, a leader has been working extremely hard. He's progressed through her career based on their skills. Um, kind of the lone ranger being able to do things themselves. Now, all of a sudden, they're at an altitude in the organization where they have to leverage others. And that's a tough shift. So often that's my entry point because they're trying to learn how to do exactly that. Showing competence, that's not so hard, but showing care and consistency, those are the two areas of development. So I was working with a senior leader who his heart was in the right place. His value, his aspiration was to be there for his people. In fact, more than anything else, he wanted an open door policy. He wanted to model open communication. And in the beginning, people were excited about that. The problem was all the other things he had to do, all the management side of things that he had to do, the balls that he had to juggle, he got fragmented. He wasn't able to keep that door open. Or if the door was open, he wasn't in the office. So all of a sudden, there was a break in that consistency. So we had to work on, you know, what's an authentic way to be available and come up with new strategies of being there for his people, but not 24/7 and giving the impression that they can have access anytime. And then showing care. This is actually multi-layered. This has a shift in the mindset and the behaviors that follow. So the shift in the mindset is one where I think humility does come in because humility leads to curiosity. So if I want to show, if we're working on a team together, even as colleagues, but I want to show that I care in what's important for you. I care in you thriving. I care in your success. How I'm going to do that is not what I think you need. I'm going to ask. I'm going to be curious. What gets you excited? What are you seeing that I don't? What keeps you up at night? What gets you out of bed in the morning that charges you up? What would feel like the next step for you? You know, like really tuning into what is your individual desire because everyone is different, right? You may want visibility. You know, it's not the raise, it's not even a role change. You want visibility because you want to learn more about the organization. If I know that, I know how to work in giving you that opportunity. I'm showing care.
The consistency example that you made, this
Mm,
is, I believe, something that many members of our audience can identify with. I mean, it happens regularly that the day is super busy, you get changing priorities, right? And you want to
yes.
be there for your team on the one hand, but then you also have to fulfill the expectations that are raised towards you. You mentioned in your example that you figured out a way how to do this
Mm,
authentically for this particular leader. How? Like, what
yeah.
did you do to be available to the team, but to also have guardrails?
Yes. Very good point. So, how to be available and have guardrails. And also a third is does the leader not sacrifice themselves? You know, leaders get a bad rap. I find that leaders are some of the most caring people and about the organizational mission, and they have a super difficult role, right? So, it's not that they're not trying. So, I leverage that. And I would say it's a three-layered um, working to build a three-layered response to that challenge. One is I start with the personal, let's call it the I. Then we move to the relational, let's call it the we. And then structural process possibilities, that's the it, the non-personal. So at the I level, what are the mindsets that are at play? Through inquiry, I might discover that if you were my client, I might discover that you have trouble saying no. You want to be yes to everybody. So that might be the mindset shift is how do you do triage? Or your definition of helping may need some retuning. It may be that what you're doing is actually enabling others as opposed to helping build their responsibility. So, what does help actually mean? What in that availability, what are you trying to do? That might be a mindset shift as well. So, at the I level, if we do that adjustment, then at the relational level, you know, communicating clearly what you actually mean. We often will say, hey, come to me anytime. That's not so great. So being more specific in what your offer is, what are the rules of engagement? What does your availability really mean? Friday mornings, listen, I'm going to be in an hour early. If you want to grab a coffee, if you want to just come in for quick questions, I'll always be hanging out. I'll keep it clear in my calendar. One client I had a end of the week last period where she wasn't doing any calls. She had no work. She was just kind of free floating and letting people come in and do check-ins, very, very unofficial. I had a client who is running a global project and the consultants working for him, they were spread all over the world. They had weekly calls, of course. The call on one week would be very it focused, the project, the status, etc. The alternating weeks was more of a check-in. How are you doing? How is it going with the client? Where are you having trouble? And the mutual supports. That was kind of hitting the I and the we in those calls. So that's the I movement, the we movement, and then structural. How do you get in contact with me? What are the protocols for communication? But I find those are easy to fix once we work at the first two levels.
These are great examples. I appreciate you sharing this.
Mm.
We spoke about the trust element um,
Hmm.
quite a bit. Wondering a little bit, where doesn't this work?
Mm.
Assume there is a leader who does everything according to how you explained that all the three C's to mitigate risk and doing it
Yep,
consistently and caring and coming across as competent. Have you been in a situation where someone was doing this, but it still didn't help building trust?
I have. It's happened several times actually, and there's a theme at what I discover. And what I discover is there's something in the system that's bigger than them. So that could be a cultural, an organizational cultural artifact. There could be a team dynamic or a history inside the team that could make that hard. So that no matter how well the individual's performing, if you will, they're coming up against forces sometimes they're not even aware of if they've stepped into a new role, for example. And what I mean by like organizational structures, I also work with teams. And one of the things I'm always listening is, this is where my intelligence background comes in. What are the unspoken agreements? How are things really done? Not on the org chart, but how are they really done? Are people allowed to say no? Are people allowed to make a mistake? Are people allowed to challenge management? Those are kind of my, early warning things I'm looking for. And if that's not there, that tells me there's something systemic that's going to make it very difficult for a leader to navigate unless they start acknowledging that, making what's invisible visible. But that's more than just working with the leader. That's now working inside a team context and potentially a system context. Sometimes that's a managing up coaching engagement, for example. How to influence beyond your role and influence the leader above you.
And influence is then, in my mind, also connected in the ability to bring across a message and to inspire others, either below your level or above your level.
Mm,
Now, let me challenge you a little bit here, Dave. You
sure.
were able to be very structured in how you explained what can be done to build trust. Can you apply a similarly structured approach when it comes to inspiring others?
Yes, I confess I'm giving you a structured approach, probably for ease of explanation. The reality is it's quite fluid, right? And it's not as compartmented. And when you're going to um enroll, envision, inspire, that's almost all emotional. I was working with a colleague, with a bunch of biochemists, and we were working on exactly things like this. And at one point, one of them just kind of burst out and said, "I miss molecules." And we're like, "Yeah, exactly. Like what?" And he goes, "Yeah, I miss molecules because when you apply heat to molecules, they move in very predictable ways. When you apply heat to people, they go crazy." And what he was putting his finger on is, now we're in the world of human beings. They're not all logic, right? We work, in fact, emotions, and that drives behavior far more than anything else. And I don't think there's a leader alive today that hasn't heard of emotional intelligence by now, and that was important work. But it's so much more than that. We still have a tendency to sub-optimize that, or say, that's the soft skills of leadership. That's actually the greatest leverage for getting followership. If you can appeal to someone, inspire them, show care. I still remember my sixth grade English teacher, not because of English, not because of the subject, but because of who he was, how he approached teaching. I didn't understand that at the time, but he inspired me. In fact, he's one of the greatest influencers of my life in terms of learning. That's what we're talking about. So, is there a formula for that? I don't think so, but I think there's much more around the dynamics of authenticity, vulnerability, and care again. Yeah.
Is it safe to assume that also in your sort of like military intelligence career, there were individuals who you found inspiring?
Yes. Yes. And often they were, by the nature of the work, not recognized for that. In fact, some of the silent heroes are the ones that inspired me the most. Um, and this goes to who we admire. And I think knowing who you admire is an important move. This might help with what your question is for your audience. Values are are basically our GPS, our guidance system. So knowing really well what my leadership values are is one of the most powerful things to do. And yet it's hard to talk about values. But I found if you look at who you admire and why, you're going to uncover those values. So, you know, that teacher I was telling you about, an admirable character, a silent hero in my background where I admired his ability, first of all, to make sense in incredibly chaotic situations. Not, he wasn't always perfect at staying grounded and centered, but he could always come back to that if he got thrown off. So watching him come back and get calm and centered and show vulnerability and decisiveness at the same time. We're going to move. We're going to take action. But this may not be the right course. We've got to stay open and alert. If you see something I'm missing, tell me. I'm here. I need you to give me the feedback. So this collaboration, those are values of humility, strength, courage. For me to recognize that in him, they have to reside in me. So even thinking about who you admire, whether they're real or fiction, alive or dead, will evoke that. I had a client who loved Star Trek. He admired the character James T. Kirk because he would say, like, make it so. But he only did that after listening to everyone else on his executive team. So he really liked that. He knew that value of execution and humility. So he would sit in meetings, and sometimes if he didn't know what to do, he'd kind of ask himself quietly, what would Kirk do? And he would actually get instant access to, oh, yeah, I'll do that. And it wasn't Kirk being, mysteriously channeled through him. He was accessing that part in him and he was able to speak. So knowing your values, having admirable characters that you can respond to help you, and then you're showing up differently for your people as well.
Just that I understand you correctly,
Sure.
are you saying that in order to inspire others, you need to be inspired yourself and pick and match kind of what you find inspiring and what authentically matches your own personality and then exhibit this in your own behaviors?
I think you've unlocked it, Florian. I think that's spot on because over and over and over again, when I find someone who can't get traction with their people, it's because it's blocked or forgotten in themselves. Yeah.
Then, Dave, let's perhaps transition a bit further to something that we touched on in our conversation very early on. And you mentioned changing environment, more and more complexity. And oftentimes in business, professionals become accomplished when they build a playbook that
Yes.
is consistent and that makes them successful over times. So when the conditions change because the environment is complex or because there are external factors that lead to this, how do you recognize as a leader that the playbook that you've chosen doesn't work any longer?
Yeah. It's a very important question. And I think, I always look to early warning signs, not things that are too late. You know, I have some age. When I learned to drive a car, those days you couldn't turn the steering wheel very easily if the car wasn't moving. It didn't have power steering. Once the car was moving, it was easy to move. So what are the so this is important. You don't wait until it's not working. You check, you test, you stay open. I think what's happening these days is it's getting harder to do an early warning check. Um, the playbook starts hitting a wall. Your best practices are no longer getting traction. What you've done before isn't working. Now, human nature being what it is, and what I see and my observing is the tendency is to double down on it. If it's not working, I'm just not doing it right, or I'm not working hard enough. And they start pushing harder and harder and harder. It's like me as an American, when I first lived, we were talking before about living in Germany. There's a tendency for Americans, if they don't speak German, just speak English louder. And that's kind of the behavior, right? It's like we're doing it harder and harder and harder. We're not getting anywhere. So this actually caused me to redesign my whole work. I call it the pivot because what leaders need to do now is almost like a 45-degree shift, not a 180, but a 45-degree shift, not relying just on the playbook, the best practices, the maps of success, not forget what's worked before, not push away all your wisdom and your business sense, your gut sense, but make space for something new to emerge, where imagination can lead to creativity. Where I see problems over and over and over again is we tighten the grip on the playbook and there is no room for innovation. And innovation, psychologically will start to become a threat to the playbook. So then they hold it harder. So again, and you spoke in your introduction, the importance of working at the mindset level. Uncovering this background operating system in a leader is one of the first things I do when I work with them is, oh yeah, I can see how tight I hold this. I don't make room for creativity, imagination, upgrades. And I do need to do that. And that's one of the biggest places to make space.
Let's park the idea of this like internal operating system for a moment. I find the term intriguing. So let's get back to this and stick with the playbook sort of idea for the moment. And I'm fully aware that I also use the term playbook, but playbook sounds very generic, right? You can have a
Yeah.
playbook for
Yeah.
everything. Can we make this more concrete based on your
Sure.
experience as a coach? Where did you see a playbook didn't work anymore? How did you figure it out? What did you do to fix it?
It really is. It doesn't take long, even in the initial conversation I'll have with a client, because what that playbook is, my version, your language of playbook, I call it the maps. What's the map you're using? You can very easily unpack the thinking system of how my client is tackling the problem such that he brought me in. So I need to increase gravitas because that's my 360 feedback. Um, I need to get this team less fragmented and moving in the same direction. Okay, my first question is, what have you tried? That starts revealing the playbook. So it's, what are the actions they took? What was behind those actions? What was the strategic thinking? How did they analyze the problem? Did they only look at it from a process perspective? Did they bring in the fact that their team is already overwhelmed and that there's dynamics in the team where there's low trust? Are they even aware of that? So the playbook can be pushing one particular lever and not the others. So I'm listening for, what have they tried? They're still not getting traction. Why are they not getting traction? What are their goals? That will reveal what's at play because, you know, I'd be curious to your experience, but I know especially in like mid-level management where the press is, I'm trying to be a leader, but I'm also having to manage a lot. I had a tendency to do, almost like shortcuts or automatic ways of operating that worked in the past because I don't have time. I don't have the bandwidth to create a whole new process. If I'm not aware of that, it's almost like going to automatic pilot.
I think those instances are called heuristics, like basically mental shortcuts that
Yes,
you
that's right.
apply. And I think it's intrinsically human to have heuristics and to apply them. In what you explained, do you have a very concrete example for the audience? Like what exactly was a particular situation that you were in, and what did you do? Like
Yeah.
as concrete as you can be, please.
Sure, absolutely. Very senior leader, global organization, working in a high risk area in the current situation. I mean, real time, I can talk about like the Hormuz Strait being closed and that having a direct impact on her ability. She's been very, very successful at coming in and getting teams going. So lighting a fire. And she wasn't getting traction, and it was multi-layered. So here's the first move. She thought it was just because of the situation in the world and everybody was tired and stressed and all that, and that isn't it. There's always layered. It's like peeling the layers of an onion. And what I found out is her operating system, going back to that, is come in hard, give clear goals, KPIs, steps, and expect her team to respond to it. She expected individual responsibility of each team member to rise to the occasion and meet those. What she wasn't taking into account was different styles on the team. Sometimes people work better, not with a high charging, let's go so fast that I can't follow you. This leader had a tendency to shift gears, shift directions while in motion. So in one day, the team's going in one direction. The next day she comes in and changes the direction of the team. Now, those that can match her style were doing beautifully. And what she found was she loved working with them and she was irritated with the ones that weren't following her style. And her mental model was they weren't up to the challenge or they weren't dedicated enough. But it was her style that was getting in the way. So this was a personal leadership style playbook of kind of not having a portfolio or a repertoire of how to respond to different people, how to change her cadence to get everybody on board, to get momentum going, how to lead from not only the front, but the side and the back. So that was what needed to emerge for her.
So how did you go about bringing
How
out
did
this
I get
behavior?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, right. So once that was clear in my mind, then we started exploring what speed does she like to operate with? What is automatic pilot for her? What's her ideal state? Then we started looking at her judgments about the non-ideal states, and then I challenged them. What's the possibility that they're not incompetent, stupid, slow, tired? What's the possibility they're seeing something you don't even see? And it would be good for you to know what they see. So I dropped in as an experiment for her, get more curious. Instead of judging them, shutting them off, getting irritated with them, and just focusing on what she called her strong leaders, She got curious. What is it they see that I don't see? Why are they moving slow? And to be honest, when she first started asking, they were a little nervous because this was a shift in behavior. It took time, but someone would say something and they weren't killed. And then all of a sudden, within a short period of time, she was coming back to me going, guess what? They're seeing this, this, and this. I didn't even know that was going on. And what was happening is they weren't going to tell her because they didn't want to receive her wrath, you know? So she learned an important lesson that her style was shutting down information she needed. That changed the whole dynamic. Her showing curiosity is another way of showing care. So then people felt included, and then they were stepping up in ways that she couldn't even see that was possible. They were sharing information that, quite frankly, they didn't feel motivated to share before. So it wasn't just her improvement as a leader, the whole team dynamic shifted.
I'm wondering in my mind a little bit. I mean, this sticking with this particular example, right? You mentioned that she was known for coming in hard, fixing the problems that seemed difficult to fix. So it implies, in my mind, a track record of success. What she did
Yes.
in the past apparently worked. And then she goes into this new team, tackles this new challenge, and her playbook, using this word again, suddenly didn't work the way she thought it may.
Yes.
What was different in this particular team, in this situation, compared to the successes that she had in the past?
Yeah, a lot of factors, right? So the composition of the team was more
Mhm.
diverse. They were less like her. They were no less successful, but they were less like her style, her leadership style, the things that she paid attention to, the speed that she liked. So that's one factor. The other factor was the operating environment that they were in. Very, very different pace. So it was a stretch for her. This was a new altitude in the organization for her. So she had a good track record. There was a sweet spot for that track record. You know, the conditions were right. It's like when I go sailing on Lake Geneva, I'm a great sailor when the wind is like very calm and the water's very flat. If it's turbulent, I'm not a good sailor. And she was great in that sweet spot. But when it got turbulent, what was happening was like her internal system was vibrating differently. She was picking up on the stress and pressure of it in unconscious ways. So again, I work at a deeper level to be able to work at a deeper level at mindsets, what's going on internally in the system so that the behavior can change and follow up. So, you'll always hear from me if you're asking, what's a concrete 3 steps forward? It's always going to start with what's going on inside. How do we calibrate that? And it wasn't that she was deficient at all. She was and most humans aren't, but we've been conditioned over life and the path that we're in that blockages come into our effectiveness, our intuition, our creativity, our ability. And my job is kind of chipping away some of that blockage or helping people remember. I know that's a little more philosophical, but in practical terms, that's why I like to talk about an operating system. We upgrade the operating system. It's not that it's a new one. It's actually just cleaner. We do some debugging. So she was able to start appreciating the diversity of her team and leveraging the diversity of the team instead of being judgmental about these are the ones I like and these are the ones driving me crazy.
And I'm glad that you're bringing up this term of the operating system that leaders and executives have. Based on your experience, are there particular aspects of this operating system where you say they are universally applicable for leaders to be successful, and contrary, are there particular elements where you say, well, maybe they don't work so well in practice?
Boy, that's a great question. Let me start with the last part. I think the blockers, there's a kind of, the word sounds too judgmental and arrogance, kind of a knowing, like a mental model of knowing, of certainty that can really block effectiveness. Um, you know, we need to be able to receive a lot of data, a lot of information coming in and make decisions quickly. That's how we become good leaders. It's impossible to get all the information. We're filtering, but we forget that we're filtering. So I think, if you get too rigid in thinking, I got it, I understand it, I know it, and this is the way we're going, you're going to have problems. You can still execute, you can still be effective and be open, be permeable, not be so certain. Here's how I'm viewing this situation. How are you viewing it? We need to go. You're saying you're seeing something different than I am. So I'm going to still welcome that because you may see something I'm missing, but we're going. So I'm enrolling you into being on board as opposed to pushing you out. So that's a key player is that humility, that ability to learn, that ability to adapt. I think slow down to speed up. I can't tell you how universal, it's almost like a trap I can do with teams and individuals. We're so hardwired to jump into action, get to the solution fast, speed, speed, speed. And that's inevitably the problem. So, those in program management know that expression, right? Slow down to speed up, slow down to take time to build that team, get role clarification, get communication going. That can drive you crazy if you're used to getting into action. But boy, if you don't take that time up front, you're going to pay for it downstream. That's a key. That slowing down. Internal awareness, really being able to tune in to your gut instinct. How are you feeling about something? We have a tendency to push that aside in business settings where we're actually shutting off a different kind of intelligence. I spend a lot of time with my leaders developing relational intelligence, not just cognitive intelligence, not just emotional intelligence, relational intelligence, systems intelligence. What are you feeling? What are you sensing? Have you ever walked into a room and you go, something's off? Yesterday everybody was fine. I walked in today, something's off. Even when they go, no, everything's fine. I know something's different. The hairs on the back of my neck are standing up. So that situational awareness and then receiving those different kinds of intelligence is one of the biggest capacity builders. I know I went beyond the scope of your question, but I think it points to what some of the key success factors.
Yeah, and it is helpful, right? And I want to introduce another observation or another point. Perhaps you explained that leaders are typically in situations where they have to make a lot of decisions, like very, very fast. And it's just input and decision, input, decision, input, decision. I would like to bring up sort of like a counter observation. I think it was Jeff Bezos who basically said something along the lines that his executive team is not paid to make many small decisions, but to make only a few very high quality decisions. And then you also have like another example is Warren Buffett, right? And over the course of his investing career, I believe he made over 300 to 400 sort of like investment decisions. But he said himself, they were only 10 or 12, I don't know the number exactly, 10 or 12 decisions that really moved the needle. So when you compare these two buckets, right? The one lot of decisions all day versus only a few high quality decisions. What is your thinking in comparison?
Sure. The first thing I want to do is go look at their plus ones. How many decisions are they making? So sitting at the very top of an organization, and I work with CEOs, I have not met a CEO that only makes 3 decisions. So they have a board above them. Now, maybe the board only makes 3 decisions, or maybe the board's pointing up to God or something. I don't know, but it just doesn't fit my reality. Um, I think it's an ideal state. I think that the wisdom behind it, though, is solid. And that is, I keep working with senior leaders, including CEOs, that keep getting down into the weeds. So one of the outputs at that it level that I was referring to earlier is often it's an audit of what are the decisions they are making, what's on their plate, what's on their dashboard, what are they working with, what can they be delegating more, especially with new leaders are leaders that have stepped into a new role at a new altitude in the organization. One of the biggest trip ups is still doing too much because that's what got them there. And letting go of that is really hard. In fact, there's even a grief process that has to be paid attention to. You can't have your fingers in it all the time. You're now influencing as opposed to handling it. So the influencing muscle needs to be built. And by definition, that's a different kind of relationship. It doesn't have the same touch point that it did. So I think there's a wisdom in, reducing the number of decisions, of being at the altitude that gives you perspective to then drive it down into the organization. But the reality is, especially today, it's still an amazing amount of deciding that has to happen.
What extent do you feel that this has grown over the last couple of decades where you have been working with leaders?
Tremendously. It would be interesting to do a computer model of it. I think it's grown exponentially. You know, Back in my day, and even in the early days of my coaching, we would talk about the white water of change. We would talk about the turbulence of change, and back then we talked about it as a single event that you just kind of navigated and got through it, and then everything was fine. Or, or even it would go back to the way it was before the change. Like we return to good times. And I don't know if it was even true back then, but it's absolutely not the environment we're in today. There are competing, if you want to stay with that metaphor of whitewater, there's competing rivers crashing into each other. The playbook is no longer valid because of the speed of change. The landscape is changing. The clients are changing what they want. The workforce is changing how they work. The isolation at the CEO or top level is increasing. How do you make sense? How do you make meaning to drive decision? So that meta crisis that I spoke of in the beginning has amplified all of this. And it not only amplifies the complexity, it also amplifies our gaps. What's not missing either in the organization, the team, or the leader. What I'm not good at is going to get amplified. It's going to become more apparent. And that can be really, pretty disruptive.
Let's stick with this metaphor. I like it. The
Mhm.
wild water rivers. What is required to successfully navigate those competing streams?
It's almost a shift in even the role of a coach. I'm not so much helping them get better maps or better playbooks. I'm actually changing the navigation. It's new navigation skills. I hadn't thought about it until you asked it this way. I think that going back to those different intelligences, bringing those online, being smart isn't enough. Having emotional intelligence is not enough. Being able to pick up things, work with incomplete information, trust yourself, build trust in the team to be able to navigate and shift. What does give you a point on the horizon or a waypoint to say, okay, we've passed this point, we're making progress, or we're spinning, or we're going backwards? There are new kinds of things we have to look for landmarks, staying with the metaphor. To get concrete, it's very contextual. It's in the business, in the context that they're in. Um, how I'm making sense. Like I work with clients around the world in all kinds of environments, NGOs, global, private, government. And to step into their world, I need to be aware of what's going on. How do I manage my own sense making? How do I not get caught up in just feeling fatalistic about everything and doom scroll? How do I actually see what's possible? You know, from a philosophical sidebar for a moment, I talk about a lot of negativity. I'm actually excited where we are today. There's so much change happening, the acceleration and already new stuff, people doing really cool stuff. So one of the shifts I help my clients is not get caught up on the negativity or looking at the downside only. I think that's another piece of this. Yeah.
Can I ask you perhaps for another example, Dave,
Sure.
along when you say it's highly contextual, I would definitely agree. Out of like past couple of engagements that you had in this domain, what were the competing rivers and what did the leaders involved in these situations do to, you know, find a new North Star?
Yep. Yeah. There's one that comes to mind very easily with this. Senior vice president, global organization. The organization's going through a constriction after going through explosive growth. So just the movement of constriction is startling and disruptive at all levels of the organization, at all levels, like everyone's confused. So he's having to still lead. At the same time, the, um, the work output, I need to protect his confidentiality. The ability to do the work that they're doing for their client systems was actually increasing. So basically, back office is minimized, decimated, stretched, and exhausted. The complexity of his client systems have increased rapidly. His playbook is thrown out the window because he always worked with a robust internal team behind him. His clients were kind of in the same world, and so he could easily not cut and paste, but the approach was very, very similar. So he could get traction very, very fast. The diversity of the client system and their needs and the result of their global restrictions and complications, he was in new territory. So we so those are all those different rivers crashing at the same time. We really had to start with kind of stabilizing, how does he keep his own ground? Because everything is shifting. It's almost like, if you've ever been in a skyscraper during an earthquake, it's moving back and forth. So like, how does he get stability in this moving terrain? So we worked for a while just on new levels of what we might have called stress management. I would call resiliency and recharge. How does he look at what gives him energy and takes away energy? How do we get him more resilient so he's literally strong enough to navigate this? And then we started step by step looking at this, and those different intelligence that I was telling you about. I gave him homework to start bringing that online. So using his very fast cognitive and very sensitive emotional antenna, I started him practicing what wasn't being said in meetings. What was he seeing between the people in the team or the client systems, and coming back and sharing that with me. And in short order, he started realizing he could pick up quite a bit, and then he could start interpreting. And that started giving him a different way of seeing and going. So I could keep going with other experiments I gave him or practices to build the muscle, if you will, around those different intelligences.
Yeah, and perhaps we do this at the same time, being conscious of time just a little bit. So perhaps we can do the following for someone listening who's
Mm,
perhaps in a similar or comparable situation as your client example that you brought up. Of course, keeping in mind different contexts, different
sure.
organizations, etc. What are the first two or three questions that our audience members should ask themselves if they are in a similar situation?
First, I would say, what story are you making up about it? What's your judgment about it? Because chances are high we're feeling deficient or we're doing something wrong. And my first groundwork with a client often is to normalize this. You're not doing anything wrong. The world has changed. The environment's changed. So normalize that. What am I worried about happening? Because often we don't go deep enough. What am I really worried about happening? I'm worried about I'm not going to get the organization aligned. I'm not going to get the team together. I'm not going to cross the line of our deadlines. Get clear on what's keeping you up at night. Once you can look at it, then you can start problem solving. And give yourself room to bring in your playbook, as you said. Bring in the playbook. Don't push it away. Bring it in, because you can still harvest the best practices. Why did that work before? Now, how is it different now? And that's where your creative impulse can come in. Okay, it worked over here. It's not here. What do I need to adapt or change? Or maybe throw it out, but maybe not. And then maybe the last piece, who can I pull into this to work with me? One of the biggest things I see is the leader still trying to solve all the problems themselves. How do I leverage others?
I think these can be great questions applied in the right situation, in the right context. Now, Dave, we have covered a lot of ground. And if you had to distill the judgment at the heart of our conversation today into, let's say, the one, two, or three things, the most essential aspects, what do you think they would be?
I think, I think even the model of how you introduce this is still very, very important. The best intervention is usually our mindsets, not our skill sets. Leaders, you've got a lot of skill. What do we need to upgrade in the operating system and the mindsets? That's probably one of the key. That's the go-to for everything. The greatest lever for change is below the surface. If we did the iceberg model that everybody knows, so below the surface of the water, that's the mindset shift. Above the surface are your actions. The other piece is, what comes to me now is a quote by Viktor Frankl, or the model by Viktor Frankl of stimulus response. There's a stimulus and there's a response. We go too fast. If we can spread that space between stimulus and response, if we can create more space to look at more what's going on before we jump into action, it inevitably is going to serve you well. You look at operating room technicians, emergency room, medical services, military, law enforcement. They know that even when they have to move fast under extreme circumstances, they need to slow down to be able to move fast. They need to be able to assess the situation. So slowing down when it counts really is important. And the key to that is use your internal landscape, your internal weather system. The hot emotions of frustration, impatience, anger usually are tells that you've got a mindset in action that may be moving you too fast to conclusions. Get curious. There's a phrase I used to use in my early days of coaching: don't get furious, get curious, if that helps.
I think it does. It's a good phrase. And well, in the context of what you explained, what did you believe about these aspects, let's say, when you started coaching 15 or
Mm,
20 years ago, which has now potentially substantially changed? What is
wow.
different now versus then?
Yeah, boy, that's a deep question, I have to say. Let me see if I can be succinct about it. When I started, and this goes back to even when I was a leader, in helping people, but coaching, there was a belief system of deficiency. I'm coming in because if you're my client, you see a gap in where you are today and where you want to go. So embedded in that, we talk about operating systems or mental models. There's a deficiency. Something's wrong with you. And I really operated from that for years, decades even. And as a coach, I would take it on my responsibility to help you close that gap. So I took responsibility for your success. That put a lot of pressure on me. That also had me drive an agenda when I worked with you. It worked well, but not all the time. When I shifted my own operating system to a belief that what if you are completely whole, complete, and excellent? But through life, there have been blockages or forgetting. And that my job is not to change you, but to help recover that. That shift in stance, that shift in perspective changed how I am with you as a client. There was an unfolding process that your genius was able to emerge. Your strengths were able to come and leverage where you were weak. So that position, that subtle but profound shift in how I believed this work, how I held you, had huge implications. I've been inspired by the expression that's often attributed to Michelangelo, that the statue of David was already in the marble, and his job was just to chip away the extraneous marble. And I've kind of held that as an image of how I approach the work.
And you explained this obviously in the context of your work and coaching. To what extent do you think this can be applied to, like, this mindset to any leader who is tasked with leading teams?
This is what I do. I work with leaders in something called the Pivot Lab to basically instill that, to really work through that. I think that approach is incredibly potent, incredibly powerful. Um, think about if you are working with your team And instead of seeing what they're not doing right, having a sense that they're not good enough, how much pressure that puts on you to close the gap or to respond to them differently, as opposed to what if your job is to help them be their best? And conversely, I work with teams or I work with individual leaders to help shift. What if your role is to help your leader be their best? So that changes the whole managing up dynamic incredibly. So I'm a huge believer.
This sounds powerful. It does sound powerful to me. Now, let's perhaps start wrapping up our conversation today. And Dave, I'd like to ask you, outside of your professional domain, what are you genuinely curious about at the moment that has, well, nothing to do with your work?
Well, it's kind of hard because I don't consider that my work. I consider that my life. Um, how can I grow tomatoes when it's raining all the time? um, I'm a real geek on consciousness exploration, creativity, um, the invisible, making the invisible visible. I love taking complex, esoteric practices, the wisdom traditions, and translating it to where it can be received and understood and used and operationalized. I had a room full of FBI agents wanting to be more effective, and I introduced meditation. But if I had said meditation, I would have been kicked out of the place. But when I said, "Would you like to take strategic pauses?" It's like, "Oh, that sounds good. Yeah, we could do that." So finding the unlock, I think that's it. I think, I was an explorer as a kid. I tried to make a parachute out of a backpack and jumped off the roof of my house. Exploring and experimenting, I think is still very much alive.
When you said esoteric a few sentences ago, I was like, "Oh, is this going in the, in the right direction?" But I really like your. I mean, it's sometimes
Mm,
it's just semantics, right? When you say instead of saying it's
sure.
communication, it's strategic pauses. I think it comes down to finding a concept that works for you and applying it in the situation that you're in.
That's right. And that boy, if I can leave your audience with something else too, because it goes back to my intelligence days, situational awareness, context. So being able to find your structure of interpretation, how you see the world, and I speak into that. By the way, that's another way of enrollment, of inspiring. So I'm not expecting you to step into my world. I'm stepping into your world.
Now, Dave, as we wrap up, we have a closing tradition on this podcast, and I'd like to ask you: is there someone or something that is inspiring you right now, like a particular leader that you're potentially working with or
Mm.
worked with in the past, a book, an idea, or something else that you would like to share with our audience?
There's a book that's inspiring me right now. I've been gobbling it up in my off time. It's called Hospicing Modernity. It's a little bit of a heavy topic, but what it boils down to is kind of what we're talking about. Times have changed. This period in our civilization, our human development is changing. Something new is emerging, and like all transitions, they don't start with new beginnings. They start with endings. So, how to actually have a good ending? How to harvest the learnings and wisdom to take along to what's emerging. It is very philosophical and deep, but I find it has very practical applications. So that's something that's exciting me a lot.
And if our audience members remember just one thing from our conversation, one insight, one way of thinking differently, or one
Hmm.
action that they should take, what would you want that to be?
Find an admirable character, maybe two or three. Find why you admire them. That resides in you. That can be a good GPS system.
Well, then, Dave Schoof, thank you very much for this conversation.
You're most welcome. I really enjoyed it.